I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. Charles Betz is Vice President and Principal Analyst for Enterprise Architecture at Forrester Research. He has also worked as an adjunct professor at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and as an enterprise architect at AT&T, Wells Fargo, Best Buy, and Target. Following the CrowdStrike outage, Betz and a dozen other Forrester analysts collaborated on a report calling for a redefinition of enterprise resilience in the wake of the incident. Hi, Charlie. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, Beth. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, it's good to virtually see you. So let's get into it. There was a blog post in July from the team that summarized the Redefining Resilience report, and it described a dilemma for IT ops and SecOps. And I quote, "A spotlight is now on the near universal acceptance of increasingly frequent vendor-driven updates and the accelerating abandonment of user-side quality assurance." Can you elaborate on that? And how does Forrester recommend enterprises navigate that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Many of us see it every day, even in use of consumer-side social platforms like Facebook. They're constantly updating. And we just began to accept this in the social media space. And then even before then, or right around the same time, it had become also more and more prevalent, especially with Microsoft. Updates were just kind of flowing through and landing on our computer, and you'd click and say yes. I mean, we do this with our cell phones, we do it with our operating systems. And it's just become extremely convenient. And without too much of a history lesson, I think it's important to realize that this was not always the way it happened. You needed to update an operating system back on the mainframe. Actually, IBM was going to ship you some tapes. and
Yeah.
and it was a big deal, and you might install those tapes on a pre-production or a user acceptance environment. You might do some testing to make sure that you weren't going to break anything. Maybe the operating system was not super high on the risk radar, but if that tape also included a update for the database or whatever, well, the closer you got to the application layer, the more you would actually want to look and say, well, does my application still work? And I'm old enough to remember the days where the answer was not automatically yes. It was due diligence, it was good management, and pretty essential to have some kind of a testing sandbox. And I'm not even talking about testing the code your people write for functional correctness. I'm
Right.
talking about testing all the code you're running on top of the lower level stuff, whether you wrote it or somebody else wrote it. And oh, by the way, change management. It used to be that a major system upgrade with some layer of the stack where you had a lot of dependencies, of course there was going to be a change record. There would be a change advisory board meeting. A lot of people might want to attend that one. You had a lot of due diligence. And we're moving away from this, and it burned us. It burned the industry badly. Now, I'm not a single root cause kind of guy at all. There was multiple causes to this failure, as there usually are in any kind of complex failure. But certainly you could say that's one of the factors. And especially in the security world, one of the reasons that people got more comfortable with accepting these updates is because they also include security patches.
Right.
We all know that the adversaries out there, the hackers, are all over it, and you don't have a lot of time. And so this is the wicked problem, one for which there is no optimal solution. You can optimize on behalf of resilience and say, well, CrowdStrike should have tested more, and everybody should have tested more, and we shouldn't even be accepting these downloads. And I'm like, okay, fine. Well, that means that for every update of virus definitions and exploit definitions, you're going to add, 24, 48, 72 hours, a week and a half? How good are you at regression testing? And now we're talking against the possibility of an outage and, in the worst case scenario, a global cascading failure.
Right.
And on the other hand, we're talking about, well, I'm just going to leave my back door open in a not so good neighborhood for 2 weeks because I don't trust the lock on the door, and I need to really, they shipped me a new lock, but I'm going to take it down to my workshop and disassemble the lock and make sure that the springs and the gears are all working right. And I'm just going to not worry about my back door for 2 weeks. Yeah, right.
Somebody put it to me who's a little bit more focused on the security side. Companies would much rather have to deal with a outage for these reasons than
Mhm.
because of a cyber attack.
Yeah, it's true. You have to look at that as, okay, that was a realized risk. One
Mm,
realized risk of a unique black swan kind of global operational outage. There's been a few others, the heart bleeds and stuff like that. These don't happen that often. And so if you amortize it across all the people impacted, and you say, okay, it was either paying that amount of money, kind of per head, per company, per capita, or it was accepting all of the cyber security incidents that might have happened if you hadn't have done that.
hmm
There's no world in which, oh, it was all just sweetness and light if we'd gone that way.
Right. So, what's Forrester's recommendation on that then? How do users chart a path forward?
I don't recommend that you say, okay, well, we've got to sandbox and quarantine and test virus content packs. Anything new, anything new. We got to quarantine it for 3 weeks before we allow it in. That's exactly, I think, what we would not say you need to do.
Mm,
But on the other hand, I do think that we certainly need to understand what do we mean by resilience. There's aspects of concentration risk that were
mm,
not well appreciated. So I think this is a time for the risk management profession to step forward. I mean, they're always accused of crying wolf and such, but you need a process. IT risks are material risks. I don't claim to be a risk management professional, but I've been around the industry long enough to see even the word risk is used a little too casually in
mm,
IT circles. And yet, on the actual formal enterprise risk management side, I don't know that IT risks are given the kind of standing that they should have in the overall enterprise risk registry. Are
mm.
the IT risks, is there consensus between people who are thinking about risk in the IT context versus corporate structural governance level risk?
Well, that's where some of my other guests would say no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm just being a little cautious here because, for example, I've covered change management forever, right?
Hmm.
Change management has a risk management component. And yet I know for a fact that that risk management component, for the most part, is alienated and divorced from actual corporate risk management. There's occasional bubbles of people talking about how the two should get together and, go out for dinner sometime, but
Hmm.
I'm not aware. And if anybody wants to correct me, I'm all ears. I'm a researcher, also here to listen. I'm not
Mm,
just here to lay it down or whatever. I think we're all kind of thinking about what does this mean? But definitely a lot of organizations' business continuity plans got exercised and were found wanting. Uh, that is absolutely a true statement. Let's think about Delta, for example, in the
mm,
context of business continuity. Now, they obviously had major impacts. And pretty clearly, I think any armchair analyst could say that their continuity planning clearly didn't work out
hmm
for crew management in particular.
mm, hmm
Now, it's interesting as you think about crew management. Well, why that particular application? Customer seat management, I mean, managing the transactional load of putting people in seats and flying them around. I mean, that's a notoriously big transactional, ugly problem. One of the first ones that was solved at massive scale. Crew management, by my casual, perspective, is a couple order of magnitudes less, right?
hmm
There aren't as many crew as passengers last time I flew.
Right.
So the analysts and I were like, okay, what's going on here? And I have dug around a little bit and I haven't seen a lot of qualified opinions. Delta's not saying anything officially, but like, okay,
Sure.
usually when you see this kind of a prolonged outage, it's a database problem. Replacing physical servers that are carrying the load, actually doing the load, even if the server was totally bricked, which they weren't, there was a solution for it. Even if the server was totally bricked by the outage, totally dead, you swap in a new server, you reimage it, you repoint the workload at it, you're good to go, right? So I'm thinking, okay, they're down here for a week. It's got to be a database because that's in my experience. That's when the big uglies happen. Is when the database indexes are corrupted and you've lost data and you're trying to replay logs and execute your recovery point objectives and that's not working. And oh boy, that's when you spend 72 hours solving an incident.
Right.
And then I began to realize that maybe it wasn't that either, because what I did see in some of the accounts that I read was that the fundamental problem was one of physics. The fact that the planes and the people were in the wrong place. And this was the wake-up call. And I still, I love if somebody can correct me on this, but I think it's at least a reasonable interpretation. This was kind of a wake-up call that at the end of the day, it's the old Buddhist saying, a finger pointing at the moon is not the moon.
Ah,
A record in the database saying that an airplane is in London is not that airplane in London,
sure.
right? And
Right.
even if the database is accurate, the bottom line was that the whole staffing took this major shock. The whole flight operations and crew management took a major shock that rippled. And it doesn't matter if their system was up and accurate. They were up against now the laws of physics.
Mm-hmm.
Computers move at the speed of light. Last time I checked, airplanes don't. And so even if
Right.
they knew what they needed to do, it just took time and it took fuel to get stuff back to where it needed to be. Now,
Right.
this is not a failure of IT disaster recovery.
Hmm.
This is truly a failure of business continuity, assuming my interpretation's correct. That it
Mm.
actually was a shock to the physical system that couldn't be unwound without just a lot of hard work of flying people and getting the crew schedules aligned and canceling flights and all of that. So the point I want to make is that business continuity, in my mind, not being a BC expert, but knowing enough about risk to be dangerous, BC simulations, analyses, all of that kind of world is still absolutely essential to understanding the true risk posture, and especially the shock that might come from a IT systems outage. What does that shock mean on your physical operations?
Right.
What's the shock going to be to your supply chain? Because the transportation world is all like this. Containers don't move at the speed of light, computers do. Ocean vessels sure don't.
Mm.
Um, no, I think the transportation logistics industry probably gets this. I'm sure that the airline industry gets this, but maybe
Mm.
they just didn't have the slack in place. That's the problem. That's one of the problems with lean.
Mm.
Lean is great. I love lean. I've read all the lean books. Squeeze out waste, squeeze out waste, squeeze out waste. But what the other side of the story is, when you squeeze out all the waste, you're also taking out all the slack, which means you've got a very tightly coupled and brittle system.
Mm.
And
So
again, yeah, sorry, I'm just
when you
ranting.
when you talk about redefining resilience, aside
Mhm.
from that dilemma between resilience and response in the security world, what does that mean in your view? Going forward, what should people do?
I think in some ways, is it redefining or is it simply remembering, recapturing what's gone before, renewing?
So I've been around a long time myself.
Hmm.
And I can remember when I was in storage, disaster recovery and business continuity were redheaded stepchildren then. John Twigo used to have this bit about the person doing disaster recovery is the person who dove into the cubicle last when they were handing out the job, you know? And it seems like that's been a problem for a long time. It's just now we have these massive interconnected digital systems that run the world. And I don't know where we go from here because, to your point about the speed with a product like CrowdStrike, it's obviously essential.
A lot of this comes down to better risk modeling, better understanding of the relationship between IT and actual operational risk.
Some of my other guests have pointed to a disconnect between SecOps and the rest of IT ops in terms of the
Hmm.
people who have to scramble when something like this happens are not the people who installed CrowdStrike in the first place or selected it as a product.
Right.
Do you see any of that pattern from your point of view?
This could have happened in another domain. It's not surprising it happened in security, but could this have happened, let's say the network team? Let's say we were still back in the days when the operating system vendors didn't own the networking stack, or let's say that history had taken a different path and that Cisco actually owned the full networking stack and had a quasi monopoly, or Cisco and Juniper each had
Mm-hmm.
different TCP implementations. You didn't buy TCP from Microsoft. You buy TCP/IP from Cisco or Juniper.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you see could an event like this happen in that situation? Yes. So I think that there are certain key workloads, or you mentioned backup, a backup vendor. If we were still doing a lot of on-prem backup and you had these widely used backup vendors, and everybody's running these agents, and these agents also have certain privileges, and the agent gets update, and all of a sudden it wrecks a whole lot of people's data. Could
Mm-hmm.
that have happened in an alternate reality? Absolutely. So I think it is a matter of understanding the true business dependencies you have on the technologies you have chosen.
Mm-hmm.
And, in some ways, I hate to say that, redefining resilience for Forrester means getting a CMDB. But CMDBs actually are really important. And we've got a couple of years running now of statistical data that shows that they are strongly correlated with better outcomes across a wide range of IT
Mm-hmm.
priorities and capabilities. I know, Beth, I was shocked. Our lead statistician came to me and she said, Charlie, I don't know what a CMDB is, but boy, there's a lot of other stuff hanging off it. And we
Huh.
were doing a pretty sophisticated factor and cluster analysis, and the CMDB questions just kept on popping up. So yeah, and it's not about a CMDB as much. I always say, just don't get obsessed with the term CMDB. Think of it as the data management problem of the business of IT, the data
Hmm.
management problem of the CIO. The CFO has a data management problem. The chief human resource officer has a data management problem. Chief legal officer sure has an information management problem, not typically represented by relational databases, but more represented by documents. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
the CIO has an information management problem, and it's an information management problem that historically has been not well handled. But with the right data, with the right understanding of dependencies, and the right ability to map lower level acquired software like CrowdStrike, like
Mm-hmm.
Struts, like Oracle, like all the stuff we buy and run it at the very base level of our tech, without some ability to then map that up into the business,
Mm.
you can't understand the exposures you're running. And we as an industry are still babies at doing this.
Yeah.
And yet I talk to organizations who are at least toddling, they're at least walking, maybe not
Right.
running. Scotiabank, I can name them because they've been
Mm.
very generous in sharing their achievements via the Forrester Enterprise Architecture Awards. They've got a complete IT data mart called ScotiaCube. Its
Huh.
CMDB data is just a start.
Right. It's sort of back to the future in a
Yeah,
way.
it is. But knowing what you have, knowing the critical customer services, what supports them, I mean, specifically what we called for in the report
Mm.
was know your services and what supports them. Invest and
Mm-hmm.
maintain in a CMDB.
Mm.
Address the resilience gaps. And again, is this reinventing or is this refreshing, renewing? We actually talk about the Bank of England's operational resilience, which
Mm-hmm.
requires a self-assessment that includes not only testing resilience in terms of like drills or game days, but also looking at lessons learned from incidents and near misses.
Yeah.
The major reinvention that I suggest needs to happen, people have been talking about for a while now, folks like John Allspaw. It's not that we need to reinvent resiliency for IT, it's that IT needs to continue adopting resilience practices from domains that understand this stuff a lot better. And I
Mm.
look especially at resilience engineering
Yeah.
as probably the leading conversation, the leading discipline. You can get degrees in it. People get
Mm.
master's degrees in resilience engineering. One of the things they highlight, for example, one of the things they look at in aviation, they look at the near misses.
Ah.
You learn just as much or more from the near misses. Most IT organizations are way too busy to even think about that.
Yeah.
There's not a focus on continuous learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, the bad thing happened. Well, we had a post-mortem and everybody cried and felt good, and maybe people yelled at each other, and then it was just all. I think
Mm.
one of the other things I would suggest is that we're actually not even good at taking the learnings from a incident, a serious, severity one incident. Most organizations are pretty bad at taking the retrospectives and taking the action items and actually acting on them.
It's very interesting that an airline was among the companies that struggled in a
Yeah.
situation like this, because you'd think there would be, at least somewhere in the business, a wealth of resilience engineering knowledge, but maybe that hasn't permeated the rest of the organization.
And the cobbler's children go barefoot, and probably that knowledge is very well applied in the event of serious aviation crises. But this was a crisis that crossed boundaries. Did they take their resilience engineering disciplines and consider cross-functional problems like an IT outage that's so bad that it cascades into airline operations?
Well, I appreciate your point of view on this, kind of
Sure.
a bigger picture view, and thanks very much for joining us and sharing your insights. This has been IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R, I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U at techtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about the challenges facing security operations. Thank you for being with us so far.